This interview is brought to you in association with Rabobank.
Hello and welcome to another in our Rural Delivery online interview series. I'm Roger Bourne and with me is Dr. William Rolleston, the National President of Federated Farmers. William, thanks for joining me.
You're welcome, Roger.
William, in your address at this year's National Conference in Wellington, a big component of that was talking about advances in science and technology and the impact that you foresee that they will or perhaps could have on farming in New Zealand. Can you give us some examples or talk us through how you're viewing that whole science and technology space and what it means for the future of farming?
Well, I think the first thing is that we all can see that we're right in the middle of the digital revolution. I mean, there is technology coming at us, new smartphones and drones and all sorts of things, precision technology, precision farming. But we're also standing on the cusp of the genetic revolution. So that's just about a whole lot of information that we're getting around the genetics of plants and animals and just how we can make that work to our best advantage. And so I just see a revolution going on in agriculture over the next 10 to 20 years, where agriculture is just going to be quite different to what it was 20 years ago.
Specifically, if we break those technologies down, I guess you've got technologies that are really closely associated with the biology itself, and we'll get to that. And then you've got the technologies that are perhaps more closely associated with the inputs. It might be anything from 3D printing that tractor part to how we understand where things are on farm and whether we deliver something via a drone, etc., etc. Are there any technologies in particular that you think are going to make a difference in terms of that input side?
Precision agriculture, which is starting to move through, and Craig McKenzie in Mid-Canterbury is a bit of a leader in that. It's going to reduce the amount of inputs that we need. And I did mention in my speech about 3D printers. Just think of the impact that if you're able to print in your workshop a spare part for your tractor, just think what that does for the whole logistics of getting what you would have had, getting that part to you, all the stores and transport, etc. All you have to do is transport the raw material, and you can print anything. So this is going to be quite different and actually going to change not just what's happening on farm, but also how farms are serviced.
Drones are another interesting area, and New Zealand, in many ways, leading the world in terms of enabling them for agricultural use. There's some safety concerns about them, privacy concerns about them, but there are some fantastic Kiwi companies who are building, amazing airframes, people who are bolting on an array of sensors. What's your view on how that technology might develop on farm?
My view is that once you've been able to fit the technology to assess past dry matter on your drone, then they'll go out the door like hotcakes. I mean, nothing better than getting back from morning tea and having done something and your drone's gone out and spent a couple of hours assessing the pasture and downloaded it onto your computer, and it's all up there in graphics, and you know what your pasture wedge looks like for the next 3 months. That's going to make a big difference. I mean, there's a lot of time spent either walking pastures or dragging seed axles or whatever behind your motorbike, and this will make a big difference. It never substitutes, I might add, for a farmer going out and having a look, but just that time spent, and also time spent looking at infrastructure, etc., around your property. I certainly know in Southland there's a farmer down there who's using it for his lambing, and he reckons that over the year it's saving him 2,000 to 3,000 hours of time on his motorbike, and that has a health and safety impact too.
Yeah, sure does, and an emissions impact too, I'd imagine, until that's a fully electric vehicle. But we'll get to that at another time. One of the areas is this interface between what the technology will do and what the farmer will do. And I know that in a lot of workplaces they're now saying, okay, well, the sort of skills we want from humans are going to hone in on the things that we can't get from robots, etc., etc. And then there's a lot of talk about how technology will augment a human. So maybe you won't use a robot because it could be very expensive or high maintenance, or the technology isn't there yet, but we're better to give a pair of Google glasses to a farmer or a picker to help them identify what's going on in the field. What role for a farmer then 50 years hence, when there's a swarm of drones taking care of smaller details, tractors being run autonomously by the person you lease them from in the United States or China or wherever the manufacturer may be? What are going to be the core skills that you're going to want as a farmer, and how different are they to what you might have today?
I think the thing about technology is that it converts data into information, and the more information you have, the better decisions you can make. So if you just think about our ability to forecast the weather, the last El Nino forecast notwithstanding, but in fact, if you think about the impact there, farmers were able to make decisions much earlier than they would have otherwise, and were actually in some senses over-prepared because they sold a lot more stock than probably they needed to. But if they hadn't done that, I think they would have been in a much worse situation. So this is about farmers being able to make decisions better. And, if you think about the last 100 years, and just think from a domestic sense, 100 years ago we didn't have dishwashers, we didn't have clothes washing machines, we didn't have vacuum cleaners, and all those jobs were done by hand. So we're going to see a change in what work we do, but I don't think that we're actually going to have to suddenly be superhuman brains or whatever. I think there'll be jobs, there'll be things that we have to do, just like we still have work to do now. So in terms of the farmer, I think he's just going to be able to make decisions much better. He's going to be able to sail closer to the wind, as it were, because he doesn't have to, because he can rely on much better information coming to him.
If we move on to the biology, there is a technology or a suite of technologies that exist that we're not employing in New Zealand, and then in fact not being employed tremendously well around the world in a range of crops. I'm talking about those technologies that people might broadly refer to as genetic modification. Those are technologies, though, which, like the cell phone, have moved on from a brick to a smartphone, fundamentally different to what they were. I know you have a view that we need to rethink how we position those technologies and why we would position them in our food chain. Can you broadly outline for me what you think we should be thinking about strongly with regard to those technologies today?
Well, I have to disagree with you that these things haven't been deployed effectively. I mean, if you look around the world at where governments have actually permitted the use of genetic modification in agriculture, over 90% of farmers in those areas, in those jurisdictions, have actually used that technology. So when you give farmers choice, they've actually taken this up overwhelmingly. And this isn't a debate, in my view, about going GM or going organic or whatever. I mean, my view is that farmers need to have a choice, and you can actually see around the world that where farmers have the choice, they've taken it up, but there's still the ability for other farming systems to actually coexist, and that's the key. So my view is that farmers do need to have a choice. There's still the question about regulation. I'm not saying we shouldn't have any regulation, but I think that it's getting time for the government to actually have a look at the regulation and start to think about, well, what should we be doing in terms of regulation? Should we actually be moving to a risk-based regulation instead of a technology-based? So really look at what the outcomes are of the interventions that you're doing, whether it be conventional GM or whatever, rather than just the technology, because it's actually been shown this technology is as safe as anything and as any conventional technology. And when you're moving into the new gene editing area where you're changing, you can change as little as one letter in 3 billion in the letter you actually want, and you compare that to conventional breeding techniques which use radiation to change thousands of letters in a genetic code in a completely random way. You're actually starting to see technologies that I think even the public will see as a decreased risk from what we're doing. and yet we're regulating that like it's particularly dangerous, and that's an odd thing, I think, for us to be doing. But this, the new gene editing technology is actually going to, or it's already creating a revolution in medicine and in agriculture, and I think the world will pass us by if we don't look seriously at what we can benefit from this.
Early days conversation around GM crops for a lot of consumers looked like there wasn't a lot of benefit in it for them. Advantages for farmers, sure, they could see that, but sort of, well, why should I adopt a technology? What's in it for me as a consumer? I sense that that's changing for a couple of reasons. The sort of traits that people are looking at in plants these days might be more about deriving a specific benefit the person who consumes them. But also consumers now becoming intensely aware of the impact of farming on the environment, so therefore a mitigation to that impact is something which is a benefit for them, if only at a distance. How much does the conversation now have to be in New Zealand about how these technologies can keep us and make us meaningfully clean and green in the long term?
Well, I think it's a conversation we seriously need to have. I mean, if you think about the government's goal to eradicate all predators by 2050, that is going to be impossible without genetic technologies. You just can't spread enough poison, put out enough traps to get that last rat, possum, stoat, ferret, whatever. So it is going to rely on genetic technologies, and I think that's why the Minister said that, Minister Barry said that this is going to need technologies which we haven't invented yet, and I think that's probably true. But good on the government for actually setting an aspiration. I think it's a realistic one, but it will rely on these new technologies. But I think what we've got to be careful about is that there's a big push from certain sectors in New Zealand to say, we have to be GM free. We're not now anyway, but we have to be GM free, and this is what's going to sell our product. I think what we've really got to think about is what are the long-term values like quality and safety that will actually underpin our products, and what are the short-term fashions like GM free or the paleo diet or whatever. And so if we can use science to underpin those long-term values and actually build our reputation around those, then I think that's going to make a big difference. And when it comes to using new technologies, I think we've got to look at what the outcomes are. So if we're able to, reduce our greenhouse gases, keep more water in the rivers, reduce the amount of nitrogen that's flowing into our waterways, using new technologies, I think we have a responsibility to actually use it, not just say, we're fundamentalists, we're not going to use that particular technology.
Well, I guess it remains to be seen how that plays out. Just quickly before we go, how is that conversation in your mind going to play out? Who are the lead actors, and how do we actually make sure that happens in a sensible way in New Zealand?
I think it's really important that we start to get the scientists involved. If you look at the conversation that's going on in the USA, I've been really heartened to see that scientists, and actually a lot of young scientists, have actually entered the fray, on the web, for example, and said, look, this is not making sense. And we are seeing that in New Zealand in the debates around immunisation and fluoridation of water, that just the fundamentalists are starting to lose ground because actually the science is starting to come to the fore. And I think we need to have a similar conversation around technologies like genetic modification, because when you look at climate change, we all accept that the scientific consensus is that the climate is changing and humanity has an impact. If we look at genetic modification, somehow we ignore the scientific consensus, which is overwhelmingly that this is a technology which is as safe as our current conventional breeding. So I think it's going to need scientists to actually stand up and not sit back and say, "Oh, I'm just waiting for, when someone real comes and asks me, and then I'll give my opinion. Otherwise, I'm going to keep my head down because I'm going to look like I've got a, vested interest, or I will have compromised my final great opinion, and I just think they're losing ground very quickly. So that would be my plea, is for, and some scientists have stood up and got on them for doing it, but I think we need more. We need more scientists to enter the conversation.
Right, William, we're going to have to end it there. Thank you very much for your time. It's going to be fascinating to see how that plays out, and that broader technology space also. We'll stay in touch. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Roger.
This interview was brought to you in association with Rabobank.